Hello, and welcome to This Week Explained, your essential download on the global stories that are making headlines. We're ready to unpack yet another complex week from around the globe. But first, before we dive in, just a quick reminder. If you want to get each new episode automatically, please make sure that you're following or subscribed wherever you're listening right now. It's the easiest and fastest way to stay updated. And if you're enjoying the show and want to help others discover it, leaving a quick rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify really makes a difference. And, of course, we appreciate it. We also want to give a massive shout out to our sponsor for this episode, Fresh Roasted Coffee. Seriously, they are the reason that we can keep bringing you this show every week. If you're a coffee lover like us and appreciate seriously fresh, high-quality beans, you've got to check them out. They have a fantastic selection. Plus, they've got a special deal just for our listeners. You can get 20% off your first order by using the code THISWEEK. That's THISWEEK when you check out. Just make sure to use the link in our show notes to grab that offer. Trust us, it's some of the best coffee around. And finally, please remember that This Week Explained is part of the awesome Leon Media Network. You can discover more great podcasts over at leonmedianetwork.com. All right, let's get into why you're here, which is all the news. This week, we are breaking down the latest on the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and we are going to do a full report on the Middle East tour of U.S. President Donald Trump. So for now, let's get into the latest developments in the war in Ukraine. It's been another week and another set of complex developments in the already ongoing tragedy that is the war in Ukraine happened. And this week, all eyes were on Istanbul. Bet you...
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise. All right. So the city on the Bosporus, historically a crossroads, and this week the stage for what many hoped would be a significant step. The first direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian delegations in over a year. Remember those early days after the full-scale invasion, the frantic, desperate attempts at dialogue? It feels like a lifetime ago. The initial reports painted a cautiously optimistic picture, didn't they? Face-to-face meetings facilitated by Turkey and even with encouragement from the U.S. But as the details emerged, that optimism seemed to, well, deflate. What really happened behind those closed doors, and where did our hope go?
The optics were certainly all there. They had the flags, all the countries' flags were there. It was almost a theatrical attempt at normalcy amidst what is just utter devastation in the region. But here's the problem here. The substance, as always, is what really matters and what we didn't get a lot of. From what I've read, the Kremlin's demands were, what's a good word for this? Ambitious, maybe? A senior Ukrainian official actually described the Kremlin's demands as, quote, new and unacceptable, end quote.
Okay, unacceptable how? What were they asking for that was different from what Ukraine has heard before?
Well, the key sticking point here was territory. Moscow reportedly demanded the complete withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Luhansk regions. That's all regions that both countries actually claim as their own. And they wanted all this to happen before even agreeing to a ceasefire. Now, this goes significantly beyond even the U.S. proposed draft peace deal that we talked about last month.
So essentially, Russia was demanding that Ukraine surrender significant portions of its sovereign territory as a precondition for the guns to fall silent. That doesn't sound like a negotiation, Kerbin. That sounds like an ultimatum.
Yeah, you're right. And I've always talked about negotiating in good faith. This is not a good faith negotiation. And it's a far cry from Ukraine's stance that we saw come out in a counter proposal. So Ukraine actually presented the U.S. this proposal, and it prioritized an immediate and unconditional ceasefire first. Then we can start discussing territorial issues, starting from the current line of control, which is what's on the ground, what troops control what areas. Now, they also want the return, the Ukrainians want the return of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the Kakhovka Dam, because those bring power and resources to Ukraine. So they're not going to easily give that up. They also want unimpeded access to the Dnieper River.
So, two completely different starting points. And what was the result? Like a prisoner exchange,
hmm
a welcome, albeit limited, positive outcome, 1,000 prisoners of war on each side returning home. That's pretty significant for those families, right?
Yeah, it is. It shouldn't. We shouldn't downplay that. The families are extremely happy to have their loved ones back. The Ukrainian deputy foreign minister actually said this is potentially exciting and excellent news for 1,000 families. But in the grand scheme of the conflict, it's just a humanitarian gesture. It's not a political breakthrough towards ending the war itself.
And the talk of a potential meeting between Zelensky and Putin, that seems to have gone nowhere fast.
Yeah, that went downhill very quickly. While the Russian delegation noted the request to have Putin there was just no commitment on their side of it. Then you have the rather, let's say, colorful language coming from the Russian foreign ministry just before the talks. They called Zelensky, and I want to quote them here, that they are calling Zelensky this. It's a, quote, clown and a loser, end quote. It's hardly sets what President Trump would want, which is a collaborative tone. So I think it paints a picture of a power dynamic where one side doesn't see the other as an equal negotiating partner, and that's why you're not seeing good faith negotiation.
You're not seeing Putin show up to talk to Zelensky, and you see them making all these outlandish demands before they even have a ceasefire.
Exactly.
They definitely think they have more leverage.
And let's talk about the Ukrainian side too. They have this undercurrent of suspicion in Ukraine. And this coming from European allies as well. They think Russia's simply engaging in these talks to buy time. They want to deflect international pressure for a ceasefire and then stave off any further sanctions that may come out of it.
I mean, that's a very real concern, right?
Yeah.
We've seen this playbook before. Small gestures, the appearance of diplomatic engagement, while on the ground, the military objectives continue. The drone footage reportedly showing Russia amassing forces in the east ahead of a potential summer offensive certainly lends credence to this suspicion. And then there's the elephant in the room, which is U.S. President Donald Trump. He seems to believe that the only talks that will truly matter are between him and Putin, even suggesting that nothing significant will happen until that particular meeting takes place.
Yeah, and you're talking about someone who's, let's say, known for his deal making.
Oh, Lord.
I mean, he definitely presents himself as the deal maker.
Seems like a bully more.
Yeah, and I think he would call that's part of
Yeah,
art of making the deal.
is just coming in confident and
Yeah, bullying. We see that in the business world all the time in the United States.
yeah,
The company that bullies the other company typically wins out,
right.
in their own favor. And I think that is, I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. It's just what President Trump has learned throughout his decades of being a businessman. He's taking that into the diplomatic realm. Now, when Trump throws his hat into the ring, especially with those very public statements, whether on social media or in the regular media, I think it muddies the waters a bit too much. At this point, we're already dealing with a pretty complex situation. When you add in his perspective, we see a whole new level of interesting dynamics happen. It's particularly true when you consider how it diverges from the European approach. It even diverges from the original U.S. efforts in those Istanbul talks. It's uniquely President Trump, and it's a real study in contrasting strategies.
It does raise questions about the coherence of Western strategy, doesn't it? I mean, on one hand, you have European allies pushing for stronger sanctions and a clear condemnation of Russia's demands. And then on the other, the U.S. president suggesting a bilateral approach that seemingly sidelines Ukraine almost entirely.
Yeah, it highlights a persistent tension, the desire for a swift resolution versus the need for a just and sustainable peace that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
I just feel like Ukraine should have a seat at the table. Like it shouldn't be exclusively the United States and Russia.
Absolutely. And so I would say differently had Russia came in and won a complete and total victory, even in that the region that they're now claiming is the only part of this, and they want to have access to it. If Ukraine did not stand its ground and just let Russia run through it, then no, Ukraine does not get a seat at the table. It lost. I get war shouldn't be legal, but it happened. We can talk the morality of it and the ethics of it, but the fact remains
It happened.
it happened. Now, it's a stalemate. A stalemate means both sides get a seat at the table. And so I absolutely agree with you. And I actually agree with the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who said that putting pressure on the victim rather than the aggressor risks appeasement, not peace. So that's basically something that you were getting to as well. And look, if we're going to talk about this, we've got to talk about history. History, as you noted, Tiana, has a grim way of repeating itself in these scenarios.
So where does this leave us? A small step forward in terms of prisoner exchange, but a significant step back in terms of substantive peace negotiations.
It does feel that way, Tiana. The Istanbul talks, while that was a welcome return to direct contact, ultimately, it highlights the deep chasm that still exists between the two sides. You have Russia's maximalist demands, and they don't suggest a genuine desire for a negotiated settlement at this stage. Russia seems intent on achieving their objectives on the battlefield, and then they want to dictate the terms to Ukraine.
Okay, what about the international community? What's the takeaway for them?
I think it's continued vigilance, unwavering support for Ukraine. There's also this unified front in the face of Russian aggression. Look, this is in the European area of operations. And the European allies seem, to this day, right now, they seem to understand this now. Albeit, they understand it with this misguided push for more sanctions that's going to ultimately hurt their own populations more than it's going to hurt the Putin regime. I think the question remains whether the broader international community and indeed future U.S. policy can maintain this resolve. I know I just said this is ultimately a European conflict, but it really isn't just a regional conflict. It has profound implications for the entire global order.
Sadly, it feels like this particular conversation is far from over, even though we obviously had a lot of hope for these talks in Turkey. We will continue to keep an eye on the developments between Ukraine and Russia, but for now, we need to turn our attention to the Middle East. And this past week has brought another series of complex and, frankly, deeply concerning developments. The focus, once again, is on Gaza, following Israel's announcement of a significant new offensive, as we discussed last week. So, Kervin, as you know, like both of us, we've been tracking this situation for decades now. Because, I mean, despite what a lot of people think, this conflict in Gaza has been going on for decades, guys. This is just the newest portion of it.
Yeah.
Given that history, the question on many minds is whether the latest move truly represents a significant escalation or if it's, sadly, a continuation of the dynamic Israel faces amidst what it perceives as existential threats to its security. It's a crucial distinction to make as we try to understand the trajectory of this ongoing conflict.
Yeah, it certainly is, Tiana. Look, the name itself we talked about last week, right? Operation Gideon's Chariots. There's a certain weight that even that phrase carries, right? Referencing the biblical warrior of Gideon. Now, it signals the intent beyond just these targeted strikes. The idea of statement about mobilizing these forces to seize what they would call strategic areas and achieve, quote, all the goals of the war, end quote. That's what they would say is hostage releases and the complete annihilation of Hamas. That suggests that we're going to see a ground incursion on a scale we have not seen likely in years.
And this announcement came right as U.S. President Donald Trump wrapped up his visit to the region without any breakthrough on a ceasefire. Is that just a coincidence, or is there a connection there?
Look, it's hard to say definitively just because we're not in those rooms listening to what's going on. I know we touched on this last week. We talked about the fraying between the U.S. President, Donald Trump, and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, Netanyahu's government has indicated that this expanded operation wouldn't commence until President Trump left and his visit to the Middle East had concluded. So whether that was out of deference to the president, or it was a strategic calculation to get better prepared, or just because the timelines actually aligned with themselves, we can only speculate. We don't know what's going on in the mind of Netanyahu, but the timing does remove a potential diplomatic complication, that being doing this while Donald Trump is still in the Middle East. And that's at least in terms of this particular engagement that's going on.
The reports coming out of Gaza are, as always, devastating. Hamas-run health officials are saying hundreds have been killed in a very short period. We know these numbers are often contested, but the sheer scale is alarming. So what's your assessment of the situation on the ground for the civilian population?
Catastrophic. That's the first word that comes to mind. Look, we've been talking about the dire humanitarian conditions since the start of this. We've been hitting it hard even more recently because Israel did that aid blockade into Gaza. Now we're seeing a possible intensified military operation. So we're going to see increased displacement, more intense fighting in densely populated areas. And there are some reports of essential supplies becoming even more scarce, and quite frankly, more expensive for the people of Gaza. Now, the UN's warnings about the critical risk of famine and obviously the gut-wrenching accounts from medical professionals about severely malnourished children, this paints a grim picture. Go back to catastrophic, which I said at the beginning. Look, I remember my own deployments, getting exposed to the suffering that wars cause, being in third world countries and seeing the devastation of it. Seeing that kind of suffering, it really stays with you.
And we are also seeing reports of a significant movement of people from within Gaza, particularly from the north to the south. And I know we discussed this last week. That was one of the things that the Israeli military wanted to accomplish, was moving 2 million people south in a tiny little area.
Mm-hmm.
So since this move has started, it's because of the Israeli military?
Yeah, look, it is. And it seems to align with reports suggesting a strategy to push the civilian population into a smaller area in the south so that the IDF can operate in the north. But I know we discussed this. This kind of sounds like a rehashing of it, but it's starting. That's why I think it's important to talk about it now. The logistics of this, especially under the bombardment that continues to happen, the limited resources that are there, this is a nightmare, to say the least. Now, the question remains, where do these people go? I think that's what everybody's asking. Where do you put them? Southern Gaza is already overwhelmed.
Well, refugee camps are never really known for their posh atmospheres.
Right. Yeah, you can't make money off of refugee camps, so.
Because you're supposed to be doing it out of the kindness of your heart.
You're supposed to be.
You're supposed to be, but of course these people are being pushed into an even smaller area with less resources.
Less aid.
And less aid, and they're just being told, deal with it.
Yep.
And they had nothing to do with this conflict. And that is crap. That's crap.
That's a good word for it.
That's crap. Well, the international reaction of this seems to be a mix of condemnation and concern. I mean, that's what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
Those two things are what I feel.
The in-home reaction.
Yeah, the in-home reaction. The UN human rights chief went as far as to suggest that Israel's actions could be tantamount to ethnic cleansing. That is wild. They just came out and said it. That is a very strong statement. So
it is. It's a strong statement, but it reflects the gravity of the situation and the potential long-term consequences of this offensive. Look, that kind of language shows us that there's a deep concern about the potential for widespread human rights violations.
Potential? Already occurred.
Widespread future human rights violations.
Okay.
They haven't stopped.
The continuance of widespread human rights violations.
there's also this deliberate alteration of Gaza's demographic landscape, something you talked about since the very beginning. It seems as if Israel wants to completely change, deliberately alter the
Mhm.
demographic of Gaza. Now, I will say it is important to remember um, that this is a legal and political assessment. So the legal definition of ethnic cleansing under international law is very complex. No one has agreed to the actual definition, so it's contested.
We also saw reports from an individual who recently toured the region suggesting the U.S. should, quote, take, end quote, Gaza and make it a, quote, freedom zone, end quote. That's a rather conventional proposition. So, what do you make of that?
I can tell by your inflection and the way that you asked that you have your own opinions on what you feel. Freedom Zone is uniquely American, right?
Well, I'm just saying the fact that this person who visited this area suggested that we just sweep right in and just take it and form it into our image. Like, what?
Yeah. Well, look, it's a departure from established diplomatic norms. I'd say it's a simplification of an incredibly complex geopolitical reality. I don't think you can just do that without consequences. Look, the idea of the U.S. unilaterally taking control of Gaza raises tons of legal, ethical, quite honestly, practical questions. Who's going to go? Who's going to be there? Do I need to get
Who's in charge?
my own contract company to get my own defense contract company together and
Yeah.
secure Gaza?
Do
Let me know.
No, you don't.
No, let me know in the comments.
No.
No, don't. Don't do that. No, this is, I mean, ridiculous, I guess, isn't the word because you can make it happen, but just the sheer magnitude of trying to do this, I think would collapse in on itself. I don't think you can do it. I frankly don't think this should happen. These are opinions.
Yeah,
I just think the cost, doing a cost benefit analysis of it, I think the cost outweighs the benefit. As we say in the DoD, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. So, and why? I know it's opinion, but why do I say that? It's because none of this accounts for the sovereignty of the Palestinian people. That's first.
nobody's thinking about the Palestinian people at all, it seems like.
Right. But we are, and we're going to keep talking about it.
Right.
And whoever listens to this can understand that that's devastating. Think of your own home. I mean, now you and I have moved around, so we continue to say we're from Louisiana.
Even though we haven't lived there in
Oh my goodness, I don't think we've lived there
15 years.
Okay,
About 15.
I was gonna say
17.
17 years. I'm closing in on having lived outside of Louisiana longer than I ever lived.
Yeah, we are.
You have.
Oh,
yeah,
that's
definitely.
true. I have. That's true. I forget that I wasn't born in Louisiana. Like I remember. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I remember
forget
before.
too.
I remember before that. Yeah.
I forget you were too. I just keep thinking you were born in Louisiana. But think about it. Let's say, and I go back to my family, right? We all lived in the same area, like my dad's parents and his brothers and everybody for generations, lived on the same land. Could you imagine could I imagine another government coming in and saying,
This is
mine now, get out of here and go get into this,
Little
go to another country, right? Jordan, Egypt. That's where they want to send people to.
But in the meantime, while we get that stuff settled, you're going to live in this little tiny plot of land with
1 million, 2 million other people.
2 million other people.
I mean, you'd rightfully
And we
join
don't know.
an opposition group,
Yeah.
right?
And we don't know when this situation is going to end. You just got to buckle in, sit tight, and just deal with it.
Right.
Because this is what we think needs to happen.
And I think we do, like the conversation you and I are having right now, which wasn't part of our pre-production, but I think people need to have these conversations, or at least hear these conversations happening from pragmatic people who are just like, wait a second. None of this makes sense.
Yeah, it doesn't sound right.
Does not sound right. So that's just about the Palestinian people. It's the Middle East. The existing political structures they're not accounting for that. They're not accounting for the potential for further destabilization in a region that's already destabilized. So I think what that person was talking about is more of a fleeting thought than actual concrete policy proposal.
And yet our media took it and
Yeah.
ran with it.
Yeah, well, it's because
They-
it's something that President Trump would say, right?
Because he wants Trump's Gaza.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well, the U.S. seems to be taking a very different approach, backing this new Gaza humanitarian foundation to deliver aid, while traditional humanitarian organizations are expressing skepticism. What's the thinking behind this new foundation? Do you think they're actually going to give aid to Gazans, or
I always like to say what
we hope?
what they state, right? I will give what they're saying, and then we'll talk about their actions and whether that aligns with the two. Now, their stated aim is to create a more efficient and perhaps more secure mechanism for aid delivery. That's Israel's key point, right? They want a secure mechanism for the aid to enter. As they would say, aid is not entering, weapons are entering and being handed to Hamas, and that's how they're being refitted with weapons. And listen, what they're trying to do here is they're trying to bypass some of the challenges and criticisms leveled against existing UN agencies. Remember, Israel, since the beginning, has accused the UN of being infiltrated by Hamas and possibly by extreme anti-Semitic people. And we did that whole report where there was some validity to this. We had 24 teachers, counselors, and administrators at UNRWA in their schools in Gaza, and they were found to not just be sympathetic to Hamas, but to be actual members of Hamas. So that doesn't mean the skepticism from established organizations isn't warranted. There are also concerns about whether this new foundation has the capacity and infrastructure to meet the massive humanitarian needs on the ground.
Ultimately, Kervin, where do you see this heading? This, quote, Operation Gideon's Chariots, end quote, feels like a point of no return for many.
Yeah, I think it is a point of no return. I also think it's a dangerous escalation, but that also does not mean it isn't necessary. Look, the stated goals of defeating Hamas and securing the hostages are understandable from an Israeli perspective. That's especially true after the horrific events of October 7th. But I would say the methods and the potential cost in terms of civilian lives and regional stability are deeply concerning to me. I'm not just talking about Palestinian lives either. I think those are key to talk about. But as we discussed last week, this is going to be a very dangerous operation for the IDF and the Israeli people. So without a clear end game and a viable political solution for Gaza in the long term, this particular offensive risks creating a deeper cycle of violence and resentment. That's something the Palestinians are already dealing with, the trust issues with Israel. There's tons of resentment. Look, as someone who's been on the ground in conflicts like this, I can tell you, military solutions alone rarely bring a lasting peace.
That is a sobering thought to end on. And as we have come to realize very quickly doing this podcast every week, it is never easy discussing these issues, especially knowing the human cost. So thank you, Kervin, for breaking that down for our listeners. It is a lot to process. We will definitely continue tracking this war, but for now, let's shift our focus to the news of the week. But before we dive in, we need to take a quick break for a message from our sponsors. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, listeners. As we hinted before the break, this week the world stage belonged to one man, and his 4-day whirlwind tour of the Middle East has left us with a lot to unpack. So, President Trump, back in the diplomatic saddle, it seems, and greeted with what can only be described as a royal spectacle, which I'm sure he gobbled up. He got fighter jet escorts. He got to visit opulent palaces. He even had a parade of camels, Kervin.
Yes.
So what was the purpose of all this pomp and circumstance?
Well, Tiana, you know President Trump, right?
Yeah, he wants to be treated like a king everywhere
Exactly.
he goes. Yeah.
Optics matter. He thrives on that kind of adulation. I stopped myself from saying adulation, but then I thought, yeah, the adulation too, but his negative media appearances. He loves that as well.
Yeah, he just loves it.
It's the old adage, any news is good news.
Yeah.
No matter what. That's a uniquely US PR kind of statement.
Right.
I think what I'd say is beyond, because you want to talk about the pomp and circumstance. Beyond that, beyond the gold-plated everything in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, there was actually a clear agenda. He had art of the deal guy. He had these artfully designed deals. He explicitly stated his focus was on securing investments and agreements for the United States. While he was saying all this, the Gulf states certainly played along with all of it. We all witnessed arms deals, the Boeing purchases. I'd also say a rather extravagant gift of a brand new 747 from Qatar.
A $400 million flying palace, as some are calling it. I mean, seriously, even for a president known for his lavish lifestyle, that raises some eyebrows. What are the implications of our president openly accepting a gift like that?
Yeah, that's legally, it treads a very fine line with the emoluments clause of the Constitution that prohibits accepting gifts from foreign leaders.
So he's not. I mean, it treads the fine line.
Because was this a gift from foreign leaders, or was this a gift from, civilians of a country? Just
civilians bought a $400 million plane for the president.
This is something that when I talk about this situation and seeing President Trump in especially the Emirates, but also in Saudi Arabia, he's the poorest person in that room. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth per person in these rooms that he's in because of the oil. It's oil-rich territory. They don't give it to their people. They're only giving it to themselves and their families. So while there are tons of really rather poor, uniquely poor people in these countries, there are also uniquely rich, extravagantly rich people. And so not all of them are tied to the actual government, being voted in or having a government position. Some of them are just family members of the crown prince or, certain people within the Emirates. And they have tons of money. I don't know if you've, on YouTube, pull up a video of people in the United Arab Emirates. And they're going to show cars like you've never seen before. Bugattis and Ferraris.
Okay, well.
So he is the poorest person in this room.
So they felt bad for him.
Why did you come here in your poor plane?
Why are
you're so poor?
You're very poor.
To quote,
Anna Jalvi.
Was she Russian?
No, she pretended to be Russian. I think she was Polish.
Oh, she might have been. Why are you poor?
Why are you poor?
That's a conversation I could see them having with Donald Trump coming in with Air Force One, right? This plane from a couple decades ago.
Right.
So they give him this new one. Now, he's not allowed, like I said in the Constitution, he's not allowed to accept this gift from a world leader because that would be a bribe or considered a bribe. But beyond that, the optics are complicated. And I know we just spent about 10 minutes talking about all of this, but this isn't what piqued my interest in this whole thing. As everyone knows, former intelligence analyst for the U.S. military, and so all I could think about were the security implications. Look, that plane's going to need a complete overhaul to meet presidential security standards. It's a process that would take years. It's going to cost a fortune to do. I mean, every nook and cranny is going to need to be investigated for signs of overt, covert, active, inactive, and even currently unknown signaling capabilities.
So this gift might end up being more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah.
Like you said earlier, the juice is not worth the squeeze.
Yes.
Even some within President Trump's own political party are sounding the alarm on this. Senator Thune called it something that will, quote, attract serious questions, end quote. And Senator Rounds even invoked the Trojan horse analogy. That's yet more strong language.
It is, and it shows the unease even within his own party about the potential ethical and practical issues. Now, because all of this rose up in the media, there was mention that the plane will now be donated to the U.S. Air Force. I think that was an attempt to de-escalate the concerns. But look, that concerns me even more than it being the president's plane. Now, if it goes to the U.S. Air Force, the plane, as flashy as it is, really overshadows the substance of this trip. Trump made, I would say, some significant policy moves. We saw the lifting of sanctions on Syria, for one. That was a head-turner. A former terrorist leader takes power, and now decades-old sanctions suddenly gone. Trump described Syria's new leader as, quote, attractive, end quote. He also called him a, quote, fighter, end quote. That's quite a departure from traditional diplomatic language.
I know that's part of the reason why people keep electing Trump is they like that he is him as a human being. He's a departure from a typical presidential candidate, and
that's been the discussion of the American people for decades now.
they wanted him to.
It's not a uniquely Donald Trump thing, right?
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders was trying to catch this wave.
Yeah, but he didn't get that as far.
He didn't, because his own party took him down.
Right.
But yeah, so in the U.S., we've been talking about this. Let's quit with the old way and try a new way. And that's what President Trump's trying to do here.
Well, I can't say any of this surprises me. Trump's use of unique diplomatic language or accepting a Boeing. It was a Boeing, right?
747.
747. Okay. So it doesn't surprise me that he's doing any of this because he, marches to the beat of his own drum, which is what people really like about him. But I would like to know, what is the strategic thinking behind this apparent embrace?
I think it signals a major shift in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Trump explicitly criticized past administrations for trying to, what he said, quote, look into the souls of foreign leaders, end quote, and impose American values. Almost as if he's been listening to this very podcast.
It does kind of sound like that, because you always say that, Westerners need to quit trying to impose their ideals and their beliefs and everything on the Middle East. Well, anywhere we go gallivanting around, we try to.
Exactly. You're exactly right. Yes, focus seems to be on pragmatic engagement, prioritizing stability, and potentially seeing Syria's leader, al-Sharaa, someone who can hold Syria together regardless of his past. It's his quintessential transactional approach, prioritizing what he sees as immediate U.S. interests over long-standing principles of democracy and human rights.
Which brings us to another uncomfortable aspect of this trip, Kervin, the near total silence on human rights records in these Gulf states. Countries with documented issues regarding dissent, migrant worker treatment, even the murder of journalists. Trump seemed to gloss over all of it, focusing instead on commerce and his idea of a region moving beyond, quote, tired divisions, end quote.
And it was a deliberate choice, I think. Trump's rhetoric about a Middle East defined by, quote, commerce, not chaos, end quote, and quote, technology, not terrorism, end quote, paints a sanitized picture of the region. He's appealing to a vision of modernization and economic growth, seemingly willing to overlook the authoritarian realities on the ground to secure deals and foster a sense of regional stability. It's just a sense of it. He wants to do that on his terms, of course. It's a clear pivot away from any pretense of American moral leadership in the region.
And what about the other major conflicts that are looming in the background? I mean, the Israel-Hamas situation, ongoing tensions with Iran, and the war in Ukraine. Did this trip yield any breakthroughs anywhere?
No, not in any significant public way, I would say. So on Gaza, Trump reiterated his idea of the U.S. potentially taking over the Strip, which is what we talked about, unrealistic, to say the least. He did acknowledge the humanitarian crisis there, though. And he said it's perhaps influenced by conversations that are happening behind closed doors. Now, on Iran, he expressed optimism about a nuclear deal. But look, we haven't seen any concrete details emerge. He also talked about Ukraine. His attempts to meet with Putin fell flat. Putin sent a low-level delegation to talk in Turkey, and this was essentially seen as blowing off Trump's desire for a personal.
So, a trip heavy on spectacle and deal making, but light on tangible progress in resolving any of these major global crises.
That he will end on day one.
Is President Trump just operating in his own reality, kind of making grand pronouncements without necessarily having the leverage to back them up?
I mean, you could make me believe that that's a fair assessment. He's certainly projecting an image of strength and influence. But look, the reality, as always, is more nuanced. He's encountering leaders like Netanyahu and Putin who have their own agendas. They aren't easily swayed. And while the Gulf states were happy to shower him with praise and sign all these deals, their long-term strategic interests might not perfectly align with his. The fact of the matter is, this is what diplomacy looks like. People don't like him, or they don't like the way he negotiates. Far more dislike his approach to diplomacy by social media. But look, there were some wins here, and I think that should be highlighted. The sheer amount of monetary investment into the United States by these extremely rich Gulf nations could actually flip the U.S. economy around. Now, there are concerns in aligning with some of these nations, but regardless of one's opinions on the man himself, I would say the trip was a success, especially because the only major news that came out of this whole trip was the flying palace.
I still think it leaves us with a lot of questions. I mean, was this trip a genuine attempt at reshaping U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, or more of a transactional exercise fueled by personal ego? And not just ego, but also like his businesses? Because, he's getting his businesses and Musk's businesses all interweaved with all of these deals, probably.
Yeah.
And what are the long-term consequences of prioritizing deals over values?
Yeah, I think the answer is complex. We're not going to know in the moment. It's going to unfold over time. This trip certainly signals a distinct approach, one that prioritizes immediate gains and personal relationships, even with autocratic leadership. Now, it also downplays human rights concerns in the regions. Whether that approach yields lasting stability or creates new sets of problems, that remains to be seen. Like I said, time's going to tell. And then that flying palace, it's a symbol of the unique brand of diplomacy that we're witnessing in the U.S.
Indeed, that is a symbol that will likely keep us talking for weeks to come. As always, Kervin, thank you for cutting through all that noise and offering your expert insights. Certainly a lot to keep talking about in the future, a lot of moving pieces and a lot of uncertainty. So is there anything else you have for us?
Nope. I think it's time to pop off, and we're not hungry for once, but...
Yeah, I know. That's crazy. Also, please keep in mind next week, the sound quality might go down just a little bit while we please be patient with us while we figure out our new circumstances.
Yes.
So, yeah, we are going to release this on Monday.
Yep.
And the one on next Monday will be where things might sound a little bit different, but
might be what the OG listeners are used to. So if that was endearing to you, you're welcome.
Yeah, you want something rustic? We got it for you. Anyways, thank you for listening to us. Yeah. I said thank you for listening to us. I wasn't thanking you.
Oh,
but
well.
But thank you too. Thank you for doing this. Yeah. Anyways, thank you for listening to This Week Explained. We hope that you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. For more in-depth coverage of these stories and more, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.